Scott Farlow is the Shadow Minister for Housing and Planning in New South Wales. Sorry, I was reading my notes. And today he's going to be joining us to share all of his knowledge and policies. Usually we hold our content in Spanish, so I'm going to quickly turn 1 second into Spanish. Si estás mirando este video por YouTube y quisieras tener subtítulos, puedes apretar abajo. Hay un botón que tiene una CC y te puede traer los subtítulos tanto en inglés como en español. So now with subtitles on, Scott, welcome and thanks for joining us
Tiffy,
today.
thank you very much for having me on the pod.
How are you going?
I'm well.
You have a busy agenda. You were sharing how you have a lot of trips as well planned. Can I just start by asking you to share what your role entitles and a bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, so I am the Shadow Minister for Planning and Housing in New South Wales. I also hold the Shadow Ministry for Cities and the Shadow Ministry for the Hunter. So we were talking before about, some of the trips to the Hunter as well and engaging with the communities in the Hunter. But my role effectively has a few different facets to it. One is holding the government to account on their policies as the Shadow Minister. Another one is being able to provide alternative views from the opposition as we move towards an election and hope to form government in New South Wales about where we stand when it comes to planning, housing, and being able to address the housing crisis in New South Wales.
So we have state elections in 2 years' time, right?
That's correct, yep.
And just before starting, we were discussing how you need to be starting right now with the policies to be ready and prepared for 2 years' time.
Yeah, well, look, I think that we've had a federal election and I think some of the criticisms that have come out of that potentially are that the coalition at federal level were very good at being able to identify what the problems were, but weren't able to necessarily put forward their alternative vision to get the confidence of people throughout Australia to be able to vote for the coalition. We're very conscious of not making that same mistake in New South Wales. I think as we look at the housing crisis we face in this state, we need to have not just an analysis of what the problem is, but also some of the solutions to try and address it.
And one of the solutions that I hear often is density. And by density, we mean bringing apartments. But also there's the whole amenities and infrastructure that need to come with that. So can we discuss a bit more the whole what's being currently proposed when it comes to providing more supply and what your views are on the density itself?
Well, one of the challenges when the Premier was elected, he said he wanted to see Sydney go up. From the beginning, I've been saying we need to go up, out and over, effectively. We need to have everything on the table when it comes to housing supply. I think the government has finally come around to that as well. But there's a couple of realities that we've got to face when it comes to housing. We're not just building houses, we're building communities. At the end of the day, we're building places for people to live in. But we need to ensure that there's supply in the market where it's feasible to build and also supply where people want to live. Now, some of the challenges with feasibility have been that when it comes to apartments, it's just not feasible to build at the moment. We've seen, if you have a look in recent years, property prices for apartments have grown by about 2%, where they've grown for houses at 7%. And at the same time, we've seen the cost of actually developing grow by about 40%. So the equations, when you're looking at the feasibility to be able to develop a site, just don't stack up. And that's one of the challenges for developers in moving forward with new projects. But there's also a challenge in the market in terms of where people want to live and how they want to live. We've seen with the advent of working from home, people want a bit more space so they can actually work from home. And sometimes that means that they want to move further away from the city. And we've seen significant growth in the regions in recent years. Part of that has been because people are making different lifestyle choices, moving to places that might be more affordable, but places also where they can have more space.
And so you were just talking about how it becomes increasingly harder, or has become increasingly harder to develop as the cost of construction has gone up and prices not necessarily. So essentially developers cannot make it work at this point in time. From the wealthy perspective, we've seen a lot of challenges from developers and them trying to see how they can make feasibility and numbers work. So do you see an opportunity for the private and public sector to better work together?
Look, I think there's always opportunities for the private sector. Like when it comes to housing in Australia, it really is driven by the private sector.
Yeah.
There are opportunities where the government can leverage off their own land to be able to make that more attractive for the private sector. We've seen, of course, in New South Wales that the government's embarked upon a land audit. Now, some of those projects, despite their rhetoric about no privatisation, some of those projects have involved the private sector and have invited the private sector to be a part of them. And I think that's something where we can leverage potentially some government assets to be able to deliver more housing, as well as delivering social and affordable housing as part of that piece as well. One of the challenges in New South Wales has been the introduction of what is called the Housing and Productivity Contribution. Now that's a $12,000 tax on the construction of a new home, which sadly has made it harder for the feasibility to stack up as well. That was one of the first things the government introduced when they came to government. And in many areas, they haven't been able to actually make things stack up because of that equation when it comes to the taxes and charges that are applied to new housing.
So what's currently missing from the approach that's in place today when it comes to long-term planning?
Well, look, I think there's a couple of things in terms of long-term planning. The government has abolished the Greater Cities Commission in New South Wales, and that used to be a body that looked at what long-term planning should achieve. So we had a long-term plan for Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong, the Central Coast, and also within Sydney, what were deemed to be the three cities within Sydney. So the Parkland City in the Greater Western Sydney, the River City centred around Parramatta, and the Harbour City centred around the Sydney CBD and surrounds.
I recall that was like a 2040 plan, right? So
there was different iterations in terms of the plans that were in place. But with that sort of strategic planning, you have an idea of what's needed to support that development, what we're going to have the city look like in 5, 10, 20 years' time. That's missing at the moment. We've got housing targets for the next 5 years, but we don't have that medium and long-term plan about what our city and state will look like. And I think that's something that both the community are missing out on, but also the development sector are missing out on because it's not giving the right messages and signals to the market about where to invest in the future.
I'm guessing it's really hard when it comes, like I think Australia historically has done an amazing job with long-term planning. I wasn't even aware that this commission had been abolished. And now that I think about it, for sure, you need the 3 to 5 year targets, but you need to know where you're going and how to prioritize. And so when it comes to community concerns, so I've been hearing a lot about like, we need to bring density and everyone wants to live in proximity to the CBD, proximity to the water, transport, etc. And then those local communities won't necessarily want more people and more density in their areas. So how do you find or strike a balance?
Well, look, and that's one of the things. It's always about balance, and it's always about getting it right. And look, and I think that communities, if they buy into the process earlier, can actually be more confident about some of the results. And they've got to see a benefit for their community as well. If you're an existing resident in an area, you've got to see that there's something that benefits you from increasing densities and increasing development. Now, part of that equation is, of course, with better public transport. So things like metros, which are revolutionising how we get around cities, is part of that benefit equation that communities will look at and say, well, I now have this piece of infrastructure we didn't have before. But if all communities are seeing added traffic congestion, more strain on local schools and sporting facilities, then they're not seeing that benefit. So we've got to make sure that when we actually do have increased densification, which we do need, that we do have that community benefit that's there as well, so that that density is supported by infrastructure as well. And one of the criticisms we've had of the government's plans so far is that they've sought to increase densities around certain areas, but they haven't actually backed that up with increased infrastructure investment to support those communities into the future, both existing residents and those who are going to be moving into those areas in the near future too. Yeah,
which I guess if I'm putting myself in my own shoes and in my area, they're suggesting a lot of housing and no upgrades, I would not be happy, right? So it makes sense. Now, I'm going to change topics slightly. a lot of our viewers are skilled migrants, and many of them would work in trades and construction. So what's your view on how New South Wales specifically is handling migration policy to support the construction industry?
Well, we've done it fairly badly across Australia, unfortunately, that when it's come to skilled migration into Australia, it hasn't actually favoured groups like we need to actually build the housing to accommodate more people in the country. So we've got to change that in terms of what is actually getting preference in the migration system. And skilled labour that we need in terms of construction is one of those key things that we need to really drive that increased housing target we've got. So the challenge before us is 377,000 homes over the next 5 years.
Well,
And
it's a big number.
It's a huge number. And considering that at the moment we're about 40% off our annual target, like it's going to become an even bigger number. Now, to get those sort of completions, we're going to be looking, and the government said that they want to see that probably it's going to be development at the back end of that target if they're going to meet it. We might be looking at 100,000 or near to new homes needed per year in the back end of that housing accord. So you need a significant increase.
You need people to build them.
You need a significant increase in our workforce to be able to build that sort of number of new homes. And I think as you go through the industry, one of the challenges we often see, I can talk to stakeholders about what happens in the planning system, but at the end of the day, you need somebody to build them. And certainly skilled migration is part of that equation.
It's hard and it's tricky because, of course, when you open doors to migration, there's going to be a higher demand for rentals, let's call it. I don't think most migrants would arrive here and be buying properties, right? And we've seen that housing shortage and rents going up, right? I think rents have been growing, but not as fast as what we saw 2 years ago, which means that, of course, that demand and supply is now leveling out. Now we're talking about trying to have an equilibrium, like managing equilibriums on how you manage people coming in, and then people that need the housing to live themselves, but also to build them, right? So I have seen, not necessarily when it comes to migrants, but I have seen, for instance, WA pay trades 10K to go and move interstate at least, right? So is that something that you think would be a policy that would work? Or how would you think about policies that make sense to find an equilibrium?
Well, look, I think it's supply and demand effectively in the market. And of course, if you increase the demand in the market, that is going to have an impact in terms of prices if you're not increasing supply at the same time. And so we need to ensure that when we do have migration, and we need migration in this country, but that we do have the housing supply to be able to cater for that growth in migration, and also to cater for some of the changing trends in how we live as well. We've got lower household formation across the board. So that's having an impact in terms of our housing market too. In terms of policies like WA, I don't like the idea of states competing on things like that.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game.
Agree.
If New South Wales goes and decides we're going to steal from Victoria, then maybe things improve in New South Wales, but to Victoria's detriment. So sometimes states can get in this sort of cross-border challenge.
Fight.
And I think that at the end, it's probably to all of our detriments when we do something like that. But we do need to also make sure that we are investing and making sure for people who are at school at the moment that they see the trades as being a viable livelihood. And I've got to say, from my street, I look down it, and the two biggest houses are both owned by tradies. So, there is a very profitable life to be had in the trades, and that should be something people should be encouraged to do.
Sorry, I'm now thinking, is there something that goes into schooling and policies when people have not chosen yet what they're about to do once they finish high school? So do you think that should start with those policies with people are trying to find their interest?
Yeah, look, I think certainly at school. Like, I've got a nephew who's living the ACT at the moment, but has very much decided for himself that, his career is going to be in being in the building industry.
Okay.
And so has decided to go through, I think they've got a college program there, and is totally focused on trades, but you do have to be able to show, in a sense, that not every outcome should be university, and not every. And look, I'm tertiary educated, but and was the first in my family to be tertiary educated, but not every outcome in life should be through a university, and we should be able to say that it's a fulfilling life to be in the trades. And I think, sadly, through our school system, we have pushed more and more people into universities and turned our back a bit on the trades.
Yeah, which I think has happened all across the world, not just Australia. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I think, just trying to wrap up, if you would have any messages to Latin American migrants trying to build their wealthy life and future here in Australia, is there anything that you would recommend to them?
Well, Tiffy, I just want to say from the outset, you're very welcome in our country, and it's wonderful to have you here. And I know so many Latin Americans who've made such a great contribution to Australia. And of course, there is such a need here at the moment. And in terms of Latin Americans who might be looking at how they can best create a life for them, we want to make sure there's the opportunity there for them, as there are for all Australians, to be able to get ahead and to work hard, and to have that compact being still strong, where if you work hard, you can get ahead. Of course, when it comes to investing in property or building your own wealth, we know that it's difficult for Australians to be able to buy their first home. We had opportunities when we were in government, like First Home Buyer Choice, which removed stamp duty and allowed people to pay a smaller annual fee. Now, that's something that we want to have back on the table again in New South Wales, to be able to ensure that more people can get into home ownership, because we want that dream, that great Australian dream of home ownership, to be alive and well, and to be able to encourage people to be able to get into their first home. And we know as well that that changes. I know we were having that chat before about rent vesting effectively, and looking at some of those opportunities when it comes to rent vesting. That I've got to say, I've done it previously, where we rented a property, had an investment property as well, because we couldn't afford to live in the kind of property that we wanted to live in, and we couldn't afford the mortgage on that, but we're able to use that equity to eventually be able to do that. So these are all things that we need to look at how people are doing at the moment, and how people are using investing to be able to get ahead as well, and to be able to build up a property portfolio and build for their future.
Yeah, I was just sharing before we started these how I usually strive to walk my talk. And for me, I realized that living in a beautiful place in the eastern suburbs, I could not afford to buy there, especially not my first home. And so my personal choice was, I'm happy to rent here and then buy properties that I can actually afford. And there's plenty of affordable other areas to be investing. For me, I don't own any properties in Sydney per se. I do own in New South Wales. And that's the thing, right? I do have the, let's call it, Australian dream of home ownership, but I'm okay with delaying that a few years to make sure that I'm not going through a tough financial situation whilst I'm trying to pay a mortgage. So I think people on the other side, we're trying to show them that there's many ways of getting to that dream, really, not just it needs to be your first home. Maybe you buy 1 or 2 investment properties that hopefully one day allow you to achieve it. Really.
Well, we've got to meet people where we are in the market at the moment. And I think that dream and aspiration of home ownership is still very much alive in Australia. And we've got to, and in terms of taking a look at investments, we definitely see that it is a very solid investment that has good returns for the future. And also, by investing in property, you're building up the housing stock for people in the rental market as well, which is helping to address the housing crisis.
Completely agree. And I even had the opportunity, one of the properties that I purchased, it was my first investment property and was not in a livable condition. So even that one was like originally out of the market, and then it had to go through a big renovation, but suddenly it's like, okay, additional housing coming to the market, right? So definitely agree. Cool. Scott, thank you so much for your time.
Tiffy, it's been great talking with you.
Have a good one.
You too.